Christoph, hello. Thanks very much indeed for joining me for a chat today.
Thanks for having me. What a pleasure.
So I'm really interested in chatting with you because of your experience not only in the climate field, but also your experience working in China with some of the really key aspects of what Beijing is planning and thinking with regards to its climate policy. And I want to look at this in multiple dimensions if we could. I don't want to make it too complex, but to me it seems there are multiple dimensions. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, which you were heavily part of, the institute that looks at the green aspect of the BRI activities. So that's the external focus of China's climate thinking. And then there's the internal focus of China's climate thinking. And we can even break that down further. I'd like to think of the policy and the practicality of China's activities with regards to climate and the philosophy and thinking conceptually of what they're doing as separate things. So I hope that's not too complex. But could we begin with just the really big picture philosophy of what China's doing? I mean, we've spent years complaining that China is pumping this stuff out and they're not adhering, or at least the West is complaining that China is the problem and isn't doing enough. And yet, on the other hand, we have the ecological civilization declaration that Xi Jinping has already made, and the very apparently determined approach to saying, right, we now believe that climate, ecology, environment are a core part of how we develop our economy, how we develop our country, how we develop our civilization. So just sum up for me, if you could, what is the philosophy of China's climate activity today?
I think the philosophy of China's climate ambitions is kind of, if you look a little bit at the history, China has for a long time talked about balancing development and nature, having the ecological civilization, as you just said, which is enshrined in the constitution. There is a lot of ambition right now, at least a lot of talk on climate change, but it has not always been like this. So China really over the last 5 to 10 years has changed its approach to climate and the environment, where climate has become much more a centerpiece of their economic development model. Now, of course, looking...
So what does the ecological civilization mean? Let's begin with that. What is the definition and the constitutional impact of that?
I think that's a great question, and it's a Chinese phrase, and so it can mean many different things. The reiteration that Xi Jinping at the biodiversity conference of the parties gave is, of course, man has to live in harmony with nature. So it is not that nature is being necessarily left alone, but much more how can this ecological civilizations, or ecology and civilization, live in harmony. And I think that's a moving target that we are all trying to wrap our head around more and more what it means. And it's not a static system where you can say this is exactly where we're going, but it's more a concept and a phrase.
But it does signify that they're placing concerns about the environment, about climate, about ecology at the heart of policy making.
I think there has definitely been some important changes to put it much more at the heart of policy making and economic development. Very simply, the province heads, the governors of the provinces and the bureaucrats are more and more also responsible for the ecological part in the development. That means, for example, air pollution, that means CO2 emissions, and they're held accountable for that. That has not been the case a couple of years ago. So it is indeed more becoming a part of the general policy making and implementation.
How is public opinion responding to the government's positions on this stuff? Is there a gap between what Beijing wants and how the public sees this issue?
I think where we see the schism a little bit clearer is between what the central government wants and what the provinces want to do. Public opinion in China is, I think, for me, harder to gauge because there is, of course, social media, but there is also limitations on what's available on social media and public media.
So I'm just wondering whether from a consumer perspective, the ambitions to drive SUVs and have TVs and eat beef and do lots of travel around the world, all these considerations, how do they fit in?
I think on the individual behavior side, the kind of my feeling, and this is definitely more my feeling, is that there is a desire and recognition that China is still in a developing stage, and therefore there's a lot of catch up to do, and the right to develop and the right to consume, and that other countries have polluted more, and that therefore consumption of meat products, the driving of nice cars is important. And the desire to drive electric cars, in my opinion, does not necessarily come from the belief that it protects the climate. I think it might be a nice side effect, but it's much more very practical. You get subsidies to reduce the cost of buying an electric car, and the license plates are more easily available for electric cars compared to combustion engines. And so it's very practical policies that are, if anything, driving behavior change there.
So tell me how this is manifesting in actual policy making then. Where are we seeing change? Where are we seeing activity from the central government on these principles?
I think you mentioned kind of that I'm looking both at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's overseas financing, and of course also following very much what's happening domestically, because it informs China's overseas financing as well. And I think very clear on the overseas finance, the announcement by President Xi a couple of weeks ago to not support or not to build coal-fired power plants abroad anymore is a new development where it really manifests itself in policies. It had already we have already seen a phase out of fossil fuel investments as one of the drivers of climate change over the last years, where 2020 was the first time we saw kind of the majority of energy investments going into renewable energies from China abroad, and no new coal-fired power plants were announced with Chinese backing also in 2020. So this is where it's manifesting both in practice and in policy. Now, of course, there's a long way to go. China has been the largest financier and developer of coal-fired power plants as one of the challenges for the climate.
Let's dig a little deeper into some of those aspects you just mentioned. The coal policy seems to be something that a lot of people are struggling to fully comprehend. We've had various statements, the most recent one of note being what Xi Jinping said to Biden back in April. He promised to strictly control domestic coal power and peak coal consumption by 2025. But so much of the Western media is still blaming China for being the prime driver of new coal development, new coal investment, in ongoing coal activity. So can you just give me what is the bottom line on the coal policy?
I think you already mentioned, I think, the core of the dilemma. I think the world is hoping to get out of fossil fuels as fast as possible, to phase out fossil fuels, not to build new coal-fired power plants, but rather to accelerate the phase out of existing coal-fired power plants in order to not have zero emissions by 2050, but, and this is very much, if you look at the European Union and Germany, the question is how much carbon stock do we have in the atmosphere, rather how much carbon emissions. And kind of by phasing out late in 2050, 2060, and then only coming to carbon neutrality then, it might actually be too much carbon in the atmosphere. So the goal must be to upfront the phase out of coal. Now, China has, in its current 5-year plan, has room for developing more coal-fired power plants. It has committed to peak carbon emissions before 2030. So until 2029, China, in its own policy, can increase its CO2 emissions, which can be coming from coal-fired power plants. And only by 2060 does it want to be carbon neutral, not even climate gas or greenhouse gas neutral, but carbon neutral. So there is still a room to invest in coal-fired power plants in its commitments.
What is that investment plan? Are they going to invest new money, or are they just going to continue with the existing plants?
I think the challenge right now, and then as we're seeing with the blackouts in China, is that there is a real cost of a inefficient energy system and electricity grid and electricity market in China. There's a number of compounding factors where kind of the question of where do we need to invest in the energy system in order to avoid such blackouts? And there, I think right now internationally, there's of course a strong eye on China. What is China going to do? Is it going to invest more in coal because it believes that coal is the solution to the energy or electricity shortages, or is it going to take another path? And I think it's too early to tell really what's going to happen in order to address the current situation, mostly because the factors that drive the electricity shortages are, I think, different, A, in different provinces, and B, also of global nature. One of the main reasons is, of course, the high price for buying coal. And if you have a very high price for coal, your cost of producing electricity with coal is, of course, going up. Now, in China, the electricity price is fixed. And that means that all the coal-fired power operators are making a loss. And what we're seeing is actually that the coal-fired power plants are not operating at full capacity. So building new coal-fired power plants won't solve the problem of electricity shortage. The loss-making will still continue. You might increase the efficiency in new coal-fired power plants. But ideally, a coal-fired power plant has to run for 30 to 40 years. And so it's very... I think it's too early to tell, and unlikely that we're going to see massive new investments in coal-fired power over the next year.
The issue of the electricity problems that China has been having, the blackouts and the supply, was addressed in the UK media, in which they presented the situation as China almost doing a U-turn. They're quoting Li Keqiang talking about the fact that they need to satisfy domestic issues here, and that this represents a reversal of previous pledges on the coal issue. Is that how you're reading those comments and the situation?
Actually, I do not see such a reversal. As you said before, President Xi and others have announced that the coal phase-out will start in the next 5-year plan, so starting in 2026. So right now we're 2021, and this has been a consistent policy that China might increase their overall coal-fired power generation capacity. I think for me, the U-turn or the challenge is much more on fossil fuel subsidies. This has been an important issue over the last COPs, climate COPs. How do we decrease the use of public money to prop up spending and in fossil fuels, and to prop up fossil fuel consumption through subsidies? And last week, in the wake of this electricity outages, we saw announcements that the banking sector is supposed to support the loss-making coal-fired power plant operators. Now, this is, of course, a direct or indirect subsidy for these operators by giving them preferential treatment on the capital markets or through better loan terms. And this, I think, is a very challenging issue if we want to say we need to phase out these subsidies. And China, of course, also has its role to play, potentially even as a role model for other developing countries. And so I think that's where I'm a little bit more worried than the announcement that electricity and stability of the energy system is important. I don't think there's something so new about that.
Let me just go back to the specific issue of what the UK media are reporting, and be absolutely clear on this, because I'm quoting one paper, The Guardian, which says China plans to build more coal-fired power plants and has hinted that it will rethink its timetable to slash emissions. And the paper says that this is going to be a major blow for the upcoming COP conference in Glasgow. So, I mean, do you agree with that framing from The Guardian? Has China actually made significant change to its existing commitments? And does this present a threat to some kind of agreement at COP?
I think China reiterated its ambition to peak before 2030 and to be carbon neutral by 2060 in a number of recent meetings, high-level meetings, including the EU-China high-level dialogue on environment and climate in September. So I think it's too early to say that it's a strong deviation. And again, building new coal-fired power plants is part of the 14th five-year plan, the current five-year plan. It is not something that should be welcomed if you want to protect the climate, but it's nothing that China had not announced before.
So as we're talking about COP, what do you think China's position will be at this Glasgow conference? Is Xi Jinping going to go in there personally and represent China forcefully in this? And give us, if you could, just a quick sketch of what China's position is on nationally determined contributions.
I think that's a very, very good question. If I would know the answer, I probably couldn't even tell you. I think we have to be realistic what China has already committed and whether it's actually going to deviate from any of the commitments that it made. The desire is, of course, that China commits to an absolute emission peak, for example, not just a emission peak per se, which with no number attached. That China also therefore commits to a absolute reduction over the particularly time frame after 2030, and a clear plan how to get there. And so these would be, I think, good outcomes. It is currently unknown whether this is possible. Of course, the current five-year plan does not have absolute emission targets, but only relative emission targets. That means, for example, the CO2 intensity per unit of GDP has to be reduced by a certain number. And so most likely we're going to see similar commitments also in the NDCs as we see in the five-year plans.
So, you know, the broad picture remains one of opacity, doesn't it? I mean, there's a lot of top-line declarations, but a lot of detail missing in what that really means. I remember there was a piece fairly recently in which Wang Yi was quoted saying that a lot of these pledges need to be clarified by follow-up documents. And we haven't seen those documents yet, have we?
No, but that does not mean that they're not under development. So there's a policy framework called 1+N, which is kind of the top level goal, 1 plus N different policies that permeate through the different sectors. That is under development, and it had been announced and most likely will be part of the NDCs. There's also much more stringent control of the provinces. Again, kind of that's where I see the biggest struggle. That, of course, on the central government level, there is this double goal of peaking before 2030 and being carbon neutral by 2060. Now, the question is, of course, the provinces have a lot of possibilities to influence that goal, to implement that goal. And so the provinces need to come up with their plans. Everybody is developing a five-year plan, including the provinces. So they have to include that there, and they have to be very specific about how they reach that. And we have not seen the five-year plans so far. So there's a lot of work that currently needs to be done. Now, we have to be very conscious that the announcement of the 30-60 targets was last year. And with such a big country, it just takes a while to get everybody on board. It's not that also China can just decide something and then the plan is already there. It's a very complex economy with a lot of different interests that also have to be consolidated.
So how is that system working? I mean, how does enforcement take place, and how effective are Beijing's directives when it comes to actually getting provinces to play ball?
So the way it works, and I think that's a improvement of the compared to previous years, is again that the governors of the provinces and various bureaucrats have to report very specifically on particularly climate targets, including the emission intensity targets, which is one of the reasons, again, I said it's a complex issue, why do we have these electricity shortages. One of the reasons is that some of the provinces have not hit their emission targets, and so they were also potentially proactive in terms of shutting down parts of the electricity grid in order to meet actually the emission targets. Now, whether this is the best way to do it, it's a different question, but nevertheless, they're directly held responsible for meeting some of these targets.
It's kind of interesting, there's been this explosion in litigation, hasn't there? A lot of it driven by Beijing in public interest, filed public interest litigation suits on climate issues. Is this part of a policy that Beijing seems to think that going through the courts is the best way to control the process?
I think the courts is one way, and the courts have been beefed up. There's a lot of work going on also with kind of from the Supreme Court, so Supreme People's Court, as well, also with support of a couple of international organizations, for example, like Client Earth, that works a lot with the courts and provides capacity building and international experiences. So the courts and public interest litigation has increased, but this is not necessarily my field of expertise.
Okay, let's talk a little bit then about the investment proposal. Now, with the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, as you remember, it wasn't too long ago when China began first making its commitments to reducing domestic coal consumption and use, that people started saying, yes, but all they're doing now is they're funding all the coal overseas, and so there's still a problem. So where is the current situation with respect to the BRI and its climate activities, climate-related thinking?
I think there has been a lot of progress, really a lot of progress been made over the last, particularly 3 years. The announcement by President Xi to not build any new coal-fired power plant, I think, is very important because it solidifies the current trend that we have been seeing, that coal-fired power plant has not been the construction of coal-fired power plant and the financing of coal-fired power plants has not been so much on the agenda over the last 2 years compared to, for example, 2016, 2015, where we saw really tens of billions invested in coal-fired power. So that's a solidification. It's solidifying the trend that we see in the investment, and it's a little bit different to understand also the overseas finance and the domestic finance. The overseas finance is much more commercial driven. Not that there is not some policy goals and involved in the BRI as well, but particularly energy and investments are much more commercial, where the power plants have to make a profit. And with the cost of renewable energies coming down so far, it's just becoming so much more economical to invest in renewable energies, particularly solar and wind. And investing in coal-fired power plants is just loss-making. And so we've seen not only no new announcement for coal-fired power plants, but actually the cancellation of a number of coal-fired plants that had been already approved or even partly being constructed. For example, the coal-fired power plant in Zimbabwe, which was actively cancelled also with the ICBC. The host countries are cancelling coal-fired power plants like Bangladesh, like Egypt, like Kenya. So there's a lot of movement away from coal for much more economical reasons compared to China, where the situation is a lot more complex and potentially also not only economically driven.
Let's talk about China relative to the rest of the world. Of all the things that we've spoken of, how would you rate China's policy and activity in this field with respect to some of the other major polluting nations, whether they be the advanced nations or perhaps nations like India, which are still a little bit down that chain? Just tell me what you think that relative performance is.
I think kind of we have to, it's not so simple. It's a complex question. So to give you one answer, I think in the green finance system, kind of where the central bank, particularly the People's Bank of China, with a number of other banking regulators, kind of the banking regulator CBRC, is really aiming to push the application of green finance more than many other central banks. To give you a very concrete example, if a bank holds insufficient amounts of green loans in their portfolio, or not enough green bonds, so really the green finance part, it will get publicly scolded at some point, which in the end decreases their ability to raise more funds. The central bank also provides incentives, really monetary incentives, to hold more green assets. So it lowers the capital adequacy ratio, so banks can take on more leverage if they hold more green bonds. Now, this is something that really is groundbreaking, and really where the People's Bank of China has been a leader globally. So on the green finance space, there's a lot of things happening. Now, the problem is that there's a lot of things on the non-green finance space, so to say dirty finance, happening as well. And to reconcile both sides is extremely challenging, and that's why it's not so easy to say, like, where are we? I think there's many things where China is doing many good things, including this massive investments in renewable energy, but it's also doing a lot of things that are not necessarily aligned with the goal of the Paris Agreement.
The reason I ask, obviously, is once we come out of this COP meeting, we know very well that the Western media are going to be very critical of China's position, whatever it is, and present China as being the major problem. We've seen this throughout the years. So do you think that we're going to see this in this COP situation, and will it be valid?
I think it's too early to tell. The COP is happening in three weeks. I think we will know afterwards. I think there are a couple of elephants in the room that have to be addressed. Also, kind of with China. Number one is, of course, as I said, the carbon stock, rather the carbon emissions over time. So how do we reduce the carbon emissions as early as possible to get the carbon stock down? That's number one, and it's extremely challenging. The second aspect, I think, that is extremely challenging and is the short-lived climate gases, which already contribute about 45% of global warming, and we're currently in this China emission peaks and emission neutrality. We're only focusing on carbon emissions and not on the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So I think these are the things where work needs to be done, and where a lot of where COP can make an influence. We've already seen in the leaders, again in the European China Leader Summit, some announcements around this to include the short-lived climate gases in at least in the policy framework and the cooperation frameworks. So that's a good sign, but COP is still 3 weeks away. Let's hope we can have more positive outcomes as just some China bashing in the end.
Let me ask you a couple of sort of quick fire questions around the COP conference. What do you think China's biggest obstacle is to achieving its COP ambitions?
I think getting a fair or just transition in China, with a lot of people depending on the old sectors, is a very big challenge. That, of course, where we see the difference between the provinces, and that has to be balanced.
So you're saying balancing its ambitions and necessities with regards to economic growth and the climate goals. These are in conflict.
I think kind of much more the regional differences that we're seeing. And this has been kind of a much bigger theme over the last weeks with the concept of shared prosperity, where the recognition that the economic growth has not been equally distributed between particularly coastal cities and more provinces that are not at the coast, that we need much more balancing. And a lot of the less developed provinces are dependent often on more traditional sectors that are related to fossil fuels. So I think that's the biggest challenge, to get a just transition between the different provinces in China.
What do you think is the most ambitious target that it's set itself, the most consequential?
The 3060 target is the most consequential target, peaking before 2030 and being carbon neutral by 2060. It has really shifted the mindset of the industry, of the financial sector particularly, and of course also of policy making. It is the most important target right now for China's climate ambitions.
With respect to the commitments that it has given and the targets that it has set, what do you think its trajectory is like? Do you think it's going to meet its own targets?
I think meeting the 2030 target is very much possible. It is mathematically possible by just being extremely high on emissions in 2029, possibly unnecessarily high if you really want to push it in order to peak in 2029. But it's also practically possible. There is a lot of possibility to invest in renewable energies, which is one of the biggest drivers, of course, of carbon emissions, the energy sector. There's a willingness to address electricity markets in China, which is very challenging even to trade electricity between the provinces. So there's a lot of action. Usually China does meet its targets that it commits internationally to, and I also am very hopeful that it meets at least the 2030 target.
So much of the conversation around China is focused upon the idea of how much polluting they're doing. A lot less seems to be focused on what they're doing in the renewable energy field, in replacing those systems with new systems. Just give me your sense of their commitment, their activity, and their achievements when it comes to solar power, hydrogen power, and other renewable technologies.
Right, I think that's a very important aspect of kind of the greening China's economy. The if you look at the electricity production, China has become a leader in both wind and solar technology. I think it provides about 75% of global solar panels. It has also, with Goldwind, one of the largest producers of wind power and wind parks. It is investing globally in these renewable energy systems and the generation of electricity. So there's a lot of momentum going, both and interestingly, mostly driven by private companies. And I think this is also, by the way, an interesting conflict to explore between state-owned enterprises and private companies. So a lot of the renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, is private corporations that are driving this development. Which is also good because because of China, the cost of these renewables has come down for everyone in the world.
Let me end with sort of where we began, the really big picture look at what's happening. This theme of balancing economic growth versus ecological requirements has been a constant one throughout the entire conversation. I mean, China's desire, as you said at the beginning, to play catch-up economically, to bring its population to a state of development that it thinks is appropriate, is very strong and quite understandable to a large extent, but it is in direct conflict with a lot of these climate goals. How do you think that conflict is going to play out?
I think we are really at a point in history where we can ideally balance, particularly in the electricity system and potentially then also in the transport system, the wish for more consumption, more wealth, with a more carbon neutral economy. Just because the cost of electricity from renewable energies has been dropping so much that we can generate enough electricity which is relatively carbon free. So I don't see necessarily at this time in history that there is such a conflict when we talk about carbon neutrality. I mentioned before that the goal must be actually climate neutrality, and that this is, I think, a much bigger challenge if we have to look at the food systems, again, where particularly meat consumption contributes so much to climate change, and overall the meat consumption in China is probably has not reached its peak. So if we would look at climate emissions more broadly, I think the conflict is much more stronger than if we look at carbon emissions only.
Christoph, great. Thank you very much for your insights into this. Hopefully we can catch up after COP and see what actually transpires from those conversations. But for the meantime, appreciate you talking to me.
My pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you after COP to see what comes out of that.